is an ocean between Angola and Virginia? Today, crossing it takes hours by plane. In 1619, crossing it meant losing everything you were. This is the story of a ship that was never supposed to arrive where it arrived, of a kingdom torn apart by a war most of the world has forgotten, and of a woman whose name almost disappeared from history, but didn't. In August 1619, two armed English privateer ships attacked a Portuguese slave vessel off the coast of Mexico. What happened in the hours that followed would change the course of American history. But to understand it, we have to go back further. Not to a ship, to a kingdom. Long before there was an English Virginia, there was the Kingdom of Ndongo in what is now Angola. Its capital, Kabasa, was no small settlement. Some accounts suggest it held as many as 50,000 people, a city with markets, courts, soldiers, and centuries of history behind it. This was not empty land waiting to be discovered. This was a civilization. Life in Ndongo, before the war that would end it, was not defined by conflict. The kingdom was organized around free commoners known as Anamarinda, children of the community, bound together by kinship, tribute, and a shared relationship with the Angola, the king. Beneath the elite sat a more complicated social order, including groups who worked the land under obligations very different from what would later be imposed across the Atlantic. A reminder that servitude already existed in many forms across the region long before Europeans arrived, but that what the Portuguese and their allies were about to unleash was something else entirely. Industrial-scale human trafficking, organized for a market thousands of miles away. For decades, Ndongo and the Portuguese colony of Angola had lived in an uneasy, shifting balance, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, occasionally allied against common enemies, occasionally massacring each other's merchants over some diplomatic insult. A Portuguese assault on Kabasa in 1590 had failed outright, repelled with help from Ndongo's neighbors. For a while afterward, something like an uneasy peace held along the border. But in 1617, a new Portuguese governor arrived in Luanda. His name was Luís Mendes de Vasconcelos, and he made a decision that would change everything. Vasconcelos allied himself with a mercenary force unlike anything Ndongo had faced before, the Mbangala. They were nomadic warriors, feared even by other African kingdoms, with no loyalty to Ndongo, to Congo, or to Portugal, only to whoever armed them and let them keep the spoils of war. Given Portuguese weapons and Portuguese backing, the Mbangala turned their full force against the Mbundu heartland. The campaign that followed was devastating. Village after village fell, and in 1618, the unthinkable happened. The combined Portuguese and Mbangala army reached Kabasa itself. Picture the capital in its final days, refugees pouring in from the countryside with stories of burned villages, soldiers, professional troops called Quimbares, digging in at the city's edges. And a king, Ngola Mbandi, trying to organize a defense against an enemy his kingdom had never faced at this scale. It wasn't enough. The city fell. Ngola Mbandi fled with what remained of his court to a fortified island in the Kwanza River, called Kindonga, a retreat, not a victory. Behind him, Kabasa burned, and the Mbangala moved through its streets and outlying districts, rounding up everyone who could not escape in time. The elderly, women who had stayed behind with children too young to run, entire households taken in a single night. This is where we meet the people who would later be forced onto a ship bound for a place they had never heard of. We don't know their individual names. History rarely recorded them, but we know how they were taken, chained by the neck, in coffles, and marched down from the Kabasa plateau toward the Kwanza River. Imagine that march. No individual heroics, no dramatic escape, just exhaustion, hunger, and the slow realization that home was getting further away with every step, and that it might never be reached again. At the river, the captives were loaded onto boats and taken downstream to the coastal slave port of Luanda, where a very different kind of machine was waiting for them. The transatlantic trade itself, already more than a century old by 1619, with its own ports, its own paperwork, and its own ships built specifically to carry human cargo. Luanda by 1619 was not an improvised frontier outpost. It was a functioning colonial port with warehouses, a Portuguese garrison, Catholic clergy performing mass baptisms on captives before embarkation, a bureaucratic, almost administrative cruelty layered on top of the physical one. Ships were inspected, manifests were drawn up, human beings were counted, valued, and assigned to specific vessels bound for specific ports across the Atlantic, exactly as barrels of sugar or crates of goods would be. It was into this system, already fully operational, that the survivors of Kabasa's fall were absorbed. Among the thousands taken from the fall of Kabasa and the surrounding region, roughly 350 people were loaded onto a single vessel. The São João Bautista, under contract to deliver enslaved Africans to the port of Veracruz in colonial Mexico. One of them, historians believe, was a young woman who would later be recorded imperfectly, incompletely, under a single name, Angela. Below deck, the hatch closed, and the world above disappeared. For weeks, the only reality was wood, darkness, and the endless rocking of the Atlantic. Conditions on ships like the São João Bautista were catastrophic even by the standards of the slave trade. People lay chained or crowded shoulder to shoulder in a space with barely enough headroom to sit upright. The air below deck grew thick with heat, waste, and sickness within days. Food and water were rationed to the edge of survival, sometimes past it. Dysentery and other diseases moved through the packed hold with brutal efficiency, and there was nowhere to escape exposure to the sick or the dying. By the time the ship approached the Gulf of Mexico, dozens of the roughly 350 people who had been marched out of Kabasa were already dead, thrown overboard most likely without ceremony, their names never recorded by anyone on board. For those still alive, the days blurred into a single unbroken stretch of darkness, interrupted only by the delivery of meager rations and the sound of the crew above. There was no way to track time accurately, no way to know how much of the ocean remained ahead. Only the certainty that everything familiar, language overheard on deck, the rhythm of footsteps, even the angle of the sun glimpsed through the hatch, belonged to a world further away with every passing hour. And then, off the Yucatan Peninsula, the ship ran into a different kind of danger. Two English privateer vessels appeared on the horizon, the White Lion and the Treasurer. They were not merchant ships looking to trade. Privateering in this period operated in a legal gray zone. English ships, sometimes carrying letters of authorization from Allied governments, attacked the shipping of rival powers and kept whatever they seized. A Portuguese slave ship loaded with captives who were themselves considered cargo under the law of the time was exactly the kind of prize they were hunting for. What followed was fast, violent, and chaotic. Orders shouted across the deck of the São João Bautista. Sailors scrambling to bring the ship about, knowing full well they could not outrun two armed pursuers. Then the first shot, cannon fire across open water, the kind of sound that must have reached all the way down into the hold, where people who had never seen the ocean before this voyage now felt the ship itself shudder under attack. Boarding came next. English sailors crossing from ship to ship, close combat on a heaving deck, swords, pistols, men fighting for control of a vessel that neither side had built, over cargo that was made of human beings. Below in the dark, the captives could only hear it, footsteps shouting, impacts they couldn't identify, with no way of knowing who was winning or what it would mean for them either way. When it was over, the White Lion and the treasurer had taken roughly 50 people from the São João Bautista's hold, Angela very likely among them. The Portuguese ship, its cargo and its profits cut apart in a matter of hours, continued on toward Veracruz with those left behind. The people taken by the English privateers were now starting a second, unplanned voyage toward a destination that did not yet exist on the map their captors were originally following. That destination was north, toward an English colony that, in August 1619, was barely 12 years old and still fighting for its own survival, Virginia. The White Lion made land first, at a place called Point Comfort, near the mouth of the James River, modern Hampton, Virginia. A colonist named John Rolfe, already known in the colony as the man who had pioneered its tobacco trade, recorded the ship's arrival in his own accounts. His description of what was traded that day has survived for 4 centuries in just a handful of words: 20 and odd Negroes, bought in his account for food supplies. A few days later, the treasurer arrived as well, carrying several more Africans before continuing on toward Bermuda. Among the roughly 20 to 30 people brought ashore at Point Comfort was the woman recorded as Angela. She was purchased, the records use that word plainly, by Captain William Pierce, a prominent Jamestown official who happened to be Rolfe's own father-in-law, commander of the colony's guard, and one of its wealthiest planters. We don't know what Angela thought, stepping off that ship onto a coastline she had never imagined existed, having survived a war, a forced march, a transatlantic crossing, and a naval battle, all within the span of a single year. The historical record does not preserve her voice. It preserves only the transaction. What we can reconstruct carefully is something of the shape of her life afterward, not through invention, but through the fragments that do survive. Here is one such fragment, and we want to be honest about what it is: a plausible reconstruction, grounded in what the records confirm about the Pierce household, but not a scene anyone wrote down in these exact words. Historians know that the Pierce property included a garden, and that its produce, including figs, was part of the household's daily life and trade. It is reasonable, though not proven in this specific detail, that Angela's labor included tending that garden. So picture this: an ordinary morning, years into her life in Virginia. Angela moving between rows of vegetables and fig trees in the early light. The work itself unremarkable, repetitive, nothing like the violence that brought her here. A pause perhaps to look toward the river, the same kind of water that once carried her toward a slave port on another continent, now simply the view from a garden she did not choose, but now knew by heart. We offer this moment not as documented fact, but as a way of holding space for an interior life the archive itself erased. What the record does confirm, without question, is far more brutal, and it happened in real time 3 years after her arrival. On the morning of March 22, 1622, Powhatan warriors under the leadership of Opechancanough launched a coordinated attack across the Virginia settlements in retaliation for years of English expansion onto Powhatan land. It became known grimly as the Good Friday Massacre. In a matter of hours, 347 English colonists were killed, roughly a quarter of the colony's entire population at the time. Jamestown itself, where Angela lived and worked, had received warning just hours before the attack reached it, allowing its defenses to hold when so many outlying settlements did not. We do not know exactly where Angela was that morning or what she witnessed, but the record confirms what matters most for this story. She survived it. In a colony where a quarter of the English population was killed in a single coordinated assault, this Angolan woman, who had already survived the fall of a kingdom, a forced march to the coast, a transatlantic crossing, and a battle at sea, lived through the deadliest single day in the colony's short history. The massacre was followed by famine. Crops went unplanted or were destroyed. Trade routes collapsed. Colonists starved in the following winter in what came to be called, without exaggeration, the starving times aftermath. Angela survived this too. By 1625, when Virginia's colonial government conducted a census now known as the Muster, Angela's name appears again, recorded as Angelo, still living in the Pierce household, one of 4 servants listed there, and the only black person named in that household's record. Historians studying the document note that she had, by that point, spent roughly 8 years of her life inside that single household, in a colony that had nearly collapsed twice since her arrival. And then the documentary record simply stops. We don't know when Angela died or how. We don't know if she had children. We don't know if she ever spoke of Ndongo, of Kabasa, of the war that took everything from her to anyone who wrote it down. History preserves with precision the names of governors, captains, and colonists. It preserves William Pierce's land patents and John Rolfe's tobacco ledgers. But for Angela herself, it preserves only a handful of transactional lines, a purchase, a census entry. Surrounding an entire human life, we can only partially reconstruct. This is not unique to Angela. It is, in fact, the rule, not the exception, for almost everyone brought to Virginia in bondage during this period, which is exactly why her case matters so much to historians today. Beginning in 2017, archaeologists from the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation, working with the National Park Service, began excavating the site believed to be the location of William Pierce's home in Jamestown's Newtown district, what researchers now call the Angela site. Their goal was not simply to find foundations and artifacts, but to recover, as much as physically possible, the material texture of a life the written record left almost entirely blank. The work continued through the 400th anniversary of Angela's arrival in 2019, a moment that prompted new national attention to exactly the kind of story this documentary has told. Not a single ship arriving in a single moment, but a chain of events stretching from a royal court in Kabasa to a tobacco farm in Virginia, connected by war, by trade, by violence, and by the extraordinary, undocumented endurance of the people caught inside it. The arrival of the White Lion in August 1619 did not create slavery in Virginia or in the broader Americas. Enslaved Africans had already been present in Spanish and Portuguese colonies for more than a century by that point, and slavery of various kinds existed on every inhabited continent long before any of these ships were built. What made 1619 different was not origin, but consequence. Virginia in that same year had just held its first representative assembly, the House of Burgesses, the earliest seed of what colonists would later call self-government, and what their descendants would call democracy. That assembly and the arrival of the White Lion happened within weeks of one another in the same small colony on the same narrow strip of coastline. Two ideas were planted side by side in 1619 Virginia. The idea that free men could govern themselves, and the idea that other human beings could be permanently owned as property. Historians have spent the 4 centuries since untangling exactly how those two ideas grew up together, intertwined in the same soil. In the decades and centuries that followed the arrival at Point Comfort, millions of lives would be shaped and ended by what began with a single contested cargo off the coast of Mexico. The system that took root in Virginia in the 1620s would expand, harden into law, and eventually define the economic backbone of an entire region. A transformation Angela herself lived to see only the earliest edges of. We return now to the ocean. The same ocean that carried a Portuguese slave ship toward the Gulf of Mexico. The same ocean that 2 English privateers crossed to intercept it. The same ocean whose water once separated the burning capital of a kingdom in Angola from a struggling tobacco colony in Virginia, and whose water today is still exactly where it was then. We will likely never know Angela's original name, the one given to her before Portuguese record keepers reduced it to a single foreign syllable. We will never know the names of her parents or whether she had brothers, sisters, a home she pictured in the years that followed. We do not know what she thought as Kabasa burned behind her, or as the São João Bautista's hatch closed over her head, or as cannon fire broke out somewhere above the hold she sat in off the coast of a peninsula she had no name for. But we know she survived a kingdom's fall. We know she survived a forced march, a transatlantic crossing under attack, and a violent transfer between two slave ships in the middle of the ocean. We know she survived the deadliest single day in early Virginia's history. And we know that 4 centuries later, archaeologists are still digging, quite literally, to bring back even a fragment more of who she was. Her name, as history wrote it down, was Angela. It is one of the only names, out of thousands taken from the fall of Kabasa, that survived it all. 1619, Angola to Virginia. The war, the ship, and the woman history almost forgot.